It was a typical sunny afternoon at the local playground, the kind of day where children's laughter fills the air and parents chat on nearby benches, enjoying the warmth of the sun. The park was a safe haven for families, a community space where children could run freely and explore without worry. The swings creaked gently in the breeze, and the sound of a ball bouncing echoed across the field. Among the families was a mother and her daughter, enjoying their routine visit. The mother was keeping a close eye on her daughter, a young girl with bright eyes and a smile that could light up the whole park. She played near the sandbox, her favorite spot, happily digging in the sand and chatting with the other kids. The park was supposed to be a place of peace, a sanctuary for children to experience the joy of playing outside. It had always been a safe spot, well maintained, with security officers making sure everything was in order. Parents, especially ones like the mother, trusted the environment, knowing it was an established space for kids to run wild and play. The community knew each other, or at least they thought they did. But in a moment, everything changed. Just a few feet away from the sandbox, a woman stood at the edge of the playground, her eyes fixed on the children. This was Karen, a notorious figure within the neighborhood. She had a reputation for being overly protective of her so-called territory, the part of the park closest to her property. She often complained about kids getting too close to her lawn, too loud for her liking, or simply being on the grounds she believed were hers by some unwritten rule. Her presence alone was enough to stir unease in some of the parents. Despite her regular complaints, most families continued to go about their business, assuming she was just an eccentric neighbor. However, there was something different in her demeanor today. It was as though something had snapped. The scene, which had been calm and carefree just moments before, began to shift. The air seemed to thicken, the joyful shouts of children growing quieter as Karen's eyes narrowed. She paced, her steps deliberate, each one more forceful than the last. She stood still, eyes trained on the daughter, who was happily absorbed in her sandbox play, unaware of the growing tension around her. The mother glanced up from her phone, noticing Karen's gaze fixed on her daughter. Something wasn't right, but she brushed it off as nothing. But that's when it happened. In an instant, Karen moved. Without warning, she reached into her bag, pulling out something that no one at the park expected: a gun. The noise of the gunshot shattered the calm of the afternoon, louder than anything anyone had heard in the park before. The mother's heart stopped as she turned toward the sound, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. The playground, once full of the innocent sound of children playing, was now filled with screams. The mother screamed for her daughter, rushing to the spot where she had been only moments before. Her body felt numb, her legs shaky, but she reached her daughter. To her horror, the young girl was lying on the ground, blood staining the sand beneath her. It was not an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Karen, the woman who had always seemed like just another grumpy neighbor, had shot her daughter. And when confronted, she didn't seem to care. In fact, she said something that no one could have anticipated, something that would echo in the community for weeks to come. She was asking for it, Karen stated coldly, as though her actions were justified. The mother, frozen in disbelief, couldn't understand how things had escalated so violently. What had prompted such an extreme reaction? How had this peaceful moment at the park turned into a scene of chaos and horror in the blink of an eye? And most importantly, why was this happening to her daughter, who had done nothing more than enjoy a simple afternoon in the park? The park, which had always been a safe haven, had suddenly become a battleground, and a mother was left standing, wondering if she would ever feel safe again. As paramedics arrived and the police began their investigation, the community was left reeling from the shock. No one could believe what had happened. There were questions with no answers, suspicions growing, and a family torn apart in an instant. Karen's words lingered in the air, leaving behind a sense of dread that would haunt everyone involved. This was no ordinary incident. Something much deeper was at play, and the full extent of what happened that day was yet to be uncovered. Chaos unfolded within moments of the gunshot. The sudden, piercing sound echoed through the playground, sending every parent and child into a state of shock and confusion. For a brief second, Time seemed to stand still. The mother, her heart racing in her chest, sprinted toward her daughter, her voice trembling as she screamed her name. The world around her blurred, the laughter of the children, the chatter of the parents, all drowned out by the frantic pounding of her heartbeat. She reached the spot where her daughter had fallen, her knees buckling beneath her as she cradled the limp body in her arms. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes barely open, a trickle of blood seeping from a wound on her side. The mother's hands shook uncontrollably as she tried to stop the bleeding, her mind desperately trying to grasp the reality of the situation. Meanwhile, the rest of the park had erupted into chaos. Parents rushed to their children, pulling them away from the scene, their faces filled with panic and confusion. Some screamed for help, while others fumbled for their phones, dialing 911 with shaky hands. A few people ran to the entrance, desperately waving at the police officers patrolling the park, hoping for someone to take control of the situation. But amidst all the panic, the worst part of the scene was the terrifying calmness emanating from Karen. Standing a few feet away, Karen appeared unfazed. She didn't move. She didn't try to help. She stood there, almost indifferent, as if watching the commotion unfold was just another inconvenience in her day. Her eyes remained cold and fixed, staring straight ahead, her body stiff. It was as though she had no sense of remorse or fear for what she had just done. The mother's frantic cries for her daughter's well-being fell on deaf ears as Karen's voice cut through the chaos. She was asking for it, Karen repeated, her words chilling in their lack of empathy. The statement hung in the air, lingering like a suffocating fog. The mother, unable to comprehend what was happening, could only look up at Karen with disbelief. The words didn't make sense. How could someone justify shooting an innocent child in cold blood? The horror of the moment deepened as the mother realized that Karen felt no guilt, no sorrow for her actions. Only a strange sense of entitlement, as if her actions were somehow justified. By the time the paramedics arrived, the playground had become a scene of utter devastation. The mother, still clutching her daughter, was trembling, her mind a whirlpool of questions and fears. The paramedics quickly took over, gently but firmly pushing her away as they began working to stabilize the child. The mother watched helplessly, unable to do anything but hope and pray that her daughter would survive. Each second felt like an eternity as the medical team worked to assess the severity of the injury, their expressions grim as they administered emergency care. In the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. The police arrived, quickly taking control of the scene. Officers began to cordon off the area, ushering bystanders away from the site of the shooting, while others moved to question witnesses. The mother tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her, and she sank back onto the ground. A sense of helplessness washed over her. Her daughter was being rushed to the hospital, but she couldn't go with her. She was caught in the whirlwind of a situation she never could have imagined. The police turned their attention to Karen, who remained eerily calm, standing off to the side, as if waiting for the officers to approach her. There was no panic in her eyes, no regret for what she had done. She simply stated her name when asked, her voice steady, almost bored. When the officers questioned her about the shooting, she calmly repeated her defense. She was asking for it. The absurdity of the statement was lost on her. There was no hesitation in her tone, no indication that she even recognized the gravity of what had just transpired. As the paramedics transported the daughter to the hospital, the community was left in a state of shock and disbelief. Some parents, still in shock themselves, tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. How could someone justify shooting a child for something as trivial as playing too close to their property? The incident began to ripple through the community, spreading like wildfire. Some parents, still reeling from the horror, whispered to one another, wondering if they could ever trust the safety of their children in such a place again. For the mother, the shock of the incident had not yet worn off. Her body trembled with the weight of the trauma, and her thoughts were consumed with her daughter's condition. Would she survive? How could anyone, do something like this? The questions piled up, one after another, each more painful than the last. But perhaps the hardest question to answer was why. Why had Karen taken such drastic, violent action? Why had she believed that shooting an innocent child was justified? As the police began to piece together the facts of the case, the answers were nowhere to be found. The community stood divided, torn between the disbelief of what had happened and the growing sense of outrage over Karen's actions. The truth, it seemed, was far from simple, and as the investigation unfolded, the mother was left to navigate the painful road ahead. Haunted by the terrifying words that had echoed through the playground, she was asking for it. Karen was no stranger to the neighborhood. In fact, she had lived in the area for as long as anyone could remember. Her home was perched at the far end of the park, with a perfect view of the playground where children would often play, the swings squeaking in the wind, and the laughter of kids echoing on sunny afternoons. To the outside world, Karen appeared like any other middle-aged woman. She was well-dressed, always carrying herself with an air of authority, and she had a certain presence that demanded respect or at least compliance. But for those who truly knew her, Karen was anything but ordinary. She was known for her unyielding demands and her obsessive need to control everything around her. A member of the local homeowners association, HOA, she had long prided herself on enforcing the community's rules, even when those rules seemed outdated or irrelevant to others. If there was a blade of grass out of place, Karen would be the first to point it out. If a neighbor dared to park in front of their own house for even a minute longer than necessary, Karen would find a way to lodge a complaint. Her constant monitoring and meddling left her with few friends in the neighborhood. Most people tried to keep their distance, afraid of the consequences of crossing her. But it wasn't just about the HOA rules. Karen had developed a strange sense of ownership over the entire park. In her mind, the space that bordered her property was hers to govern, and anyone who dared to step foot near her fence or her meticulously trimmed hedges was subject to her wrath. Over the years, Karen had built a reputation as a neighborhood watchdog, someone who took her role far too seriously. Many had heard the rumors of her confrontations with children and parents who, in her opinion, had overstepped their boundaries. She had been known to yell at kids for running near her yard or playing too close to the trees that lined the park's edge. It was a minor inconvenience to her neighbors, but they tolerated it mainly because she was part of the HOA, and in their eyes, just another one of those rules-obsessed people. But Karen wasn't just any HOA member. She was the president. Her position only seemed to amplify her authority. The voice of the HOA was essentially her voice, and it was one that demanded compliance at all costs. For years, she had exercised this power with a certain smugness, confident that her word was the law. The other residents of the neighborhood quietly complied, knowing that challenging her could lead to their own complaints being raised or petty issues being escalated. And so, most people steered clear of her, hoping to avoid her critical gaze. Behind her stern exterior, Karen's life was far from perfect. Her marriage was strained, and her children, now grown and living far away, rarely visited. The house, which once felt full of life, now seemed empty. Karen's obsession with controlling her environment was, in many ways, a reflection of her need to fill the void in her personal life. The park, her neighborhood, and her role in the HOA became her world, a world she fiercely guarded, even to the point of alienating herself from the very people she lived among. As time passed, her need for control only grew stronger. Every year, she found herself more involved in the HOA's decisions, pushing for stricter rules, higher fines, and more surveillance on her neighbors. She would often suggest ridiculous policies, such as forbidding children from running in the park or requiring a permit for any outdoor activities that took place after 6 p.m., policies that the other residents would laugh off but would quietly ignore in fear of upsetting her. It was clear that her grip on the neighborhood was tightening, and her actions became increasingly erratic. Yet, despite her antagonistic reputation, Karen had a particular obsession with the playground, the very spot where the tragic event would soon unfold. She saw it as a direct invasion of her space, a loud, unruly reminder that she couldn't control everything around her. The children's noise, their carefree behavior, was a constant irritation to her. She was convinced that they were disrupting her peace and that the parents were simply too careless to see the problems they were causing. She had once written a letter to the HOA board suggesting that the playground be relocated to another part of the park far away from her view. She claimed that the children's laughter and the sound of their play was disturbing her peace and her private retreat in her backyard. Of course, her proposal was shot down immediately, but it only fueled her resentment. Despite these complaints, Karen's actions remained passive-aggressive, at least until the fateful day at the park. On that day, it seemed as if the years of frustration had finally boiled over. The playground, which had long been a symbol of joy and childhood for most of the community, had become the target of Karen's pent-up anger. Her obsession with protecting her territory led to an uncontrollable violent outburst, a response that no one, not even Karen herself, could have predicted. What was it that finally pushed Karen over the edge? Was it the constant irritation of hearing children play just outside her window? Or was it something deeper, perhaps a need to assert her dominance, to prove that she could still control something in her life, even if it meant destroying what was most precious to others? The answers would slowly begin to unfold, but one thing was clear. Karen was no longer the woman people could easily ignore. She had crossed a line that would forever change the course of the community and the lives of those involved. Her actions would be scrutinized by the public, the police, and ultimately by the legal system. But as her cold, unapologetic words would later prove, Karen had no remorse. She truly believed she was in the right, that she had been justified in taking such extreme measures. For her, this wasn't a crime. It was simply a consequence of the chaos she felt she had been forced to endure. The immediate aftermath of the shooting left the family in a state of absolute disbelief. The playground, once a symbol of joy and childhood memories, was now a place of terror and tragedy. The mother's heart raced uncontrollably as she tried to make sense of the scene that had just unfolded. How could a seemingly ordinary day at the park turn into a nightmare in the blink of an eye? The image of her daughter, lying unconscious on the ground, her tiny body stained with blood, was burned into her mind. There was no escaping it, no way to unsee the horror that had unfolded before her. As the paramedics rushed to stabilize her daughter, the mother felt a sense of helplessness that was almost unbearable. She couldn't do anything. She couldn't make her daughter wake up. She couldn't stop the pain that was tearing through her heart. All she could do was watch as the medical team worked tirelessly to save her child's life. The world seemed to move in slow motion, each second stretching on for what felt like an eternity. The fear that gripped her was suffocating, and yet she couldn't pull away from the scene. She had to stay. She had to know that her daughter was going to be okay. But the fear didn't stop there. The mother's mind kept replaying the words that Karen had so coldly spoken. She was asking for it. The very thought of it made her blood boil with anger. How could someone justify such an action? How could a mother, a person who should be the protector of children, take the life of another child in such a brutal way? The more she thought about Karen's words, the more she felt the weight of the injustice. There was no reason, no explanation that could make sense of it. There was no justification for taking a child's life, no matter what the circumstances. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, the mother clung to the hope that her daughter would survive. She tried to remember the little details of the day, the moments when they had laughed together, the happiness that had filled the air before everything went so terribly wrong. But those memories seemed distant now, overshadowed by the trauma of the present. She couldn't stop thinking about how her daughter had been hurt, how something as simple as playing at the park had led to this horror. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The mother barely registered the passing streets, the sounds of the sirens, or the hurried conversations between the paramedics. She was numb, her mind reeling, her heart heavy with an overwhelming sense of dread. She had always feared something happening to her daughter, but never like this, never in such a brutal, senseless way. She was scared, scared that her daughter might not make it, scared that this incident would change everything. At the hospital, the medical staff quickly took over, rushing her daughter into the emergency room. The mother stood frozen, her body trembling, her breath shallow. She was surrounded by doctors and nurses, but she felt completely alone. They took her daughter away, and she was left standing in the cold, sterile hallway, unsure of what to do next. Her mind was a mess of conflicting emotions. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand why this had happened, why Karen had done this to her child. But there were no answers. Not yet. As the hours dragged on, the mother finally sat down in the waiting area. She couldn't bring herself to move. She couldn't bring herself to leave. Her eyes were fixed on the door, hoping against hope that someone would come through and tell her that her daughter was going to be okay. But no one came. Time seemed to stand still. It was as though the whole world had paused, waiting for a resolution that might never come. The waiting room was filled with other families, but the mother couldn't focus on them. She couldn't focus on anything except her daughter. She tried to stay calm, tried to hold it together, but the fear and the anger were overwhelming. She kept replaying the moment in her mind over and over again, her daughter laughing on the swings, the sudden noise of the gunshot, the image of her daughter falling to the ground. It felt like a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Every time she closed her eyes, the scene played out in her mind again. The pain, the shock, the disbelief, it was all too much to bear. Finally, a doctor approached, his face grave. The mother's heart skipped a beat. She braced herself for the worst. "Your daughter is stable for now," the doctor said, his voice soft but firm. "We've managed to stop the bleeding, but the wound is serious. We'll have to monitor her closely for the next few hours, but she's not out of danger yet." The relief that flooded her was immediate, but it was tempered by the harsh reality of the situation. Her daughter was alive, but for how long? How much longer would she have to live with the memory of what had happened? How could she move on from something like this? And then, as though the weight of everything that had transpired wasn't enough, the questions began to flood her mind. Why had Karen done this? What had pushed her to this point? The anger that had been building in the mother's chest now bubbled over. She didn't just want answers, she wanted justice. She wanted to make sure Karen would never hurt anyone again. But at that moment, as she sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, there was only one thing that mattered. Her daughter was alive, and the fight to save her was far from over. The fight for justice, the fight to hold Karen accountable, would have to wait. The hours following the incident were a blur of police officers, medical staff, and concerned neighbors. The playground, once filled with the innocent noise of children at play, had now become a crime scene. Yellow police tape surrounded the area, and officers were everywhere, documenting every detail of the tragedy. The mother, still in shock but determined to understand what had happened, was questioned multiple times by the police. Her answers were shaky, fragmented. She could barely recall the specifics of the event. Her mind was clouded with panic and worry for her daughter, who remained in critical condition in the hospital. Despite the chaos of the scene, the police were methodical in their investigation. They quickly isolated Karen, who stood off to the side, her arms crossed in front of her, her expression cold and unyielding. To the officers, she seemed oddly composed for someone who had just shot a child. There was no sign of remorse, no hint of the horror one might expect from someone who had just committed such an act. When questioned, Karen was calm and collected, almost too calm. She gave the same chilling response each time. She was asking for it. The officers exchanged looks, but their training kept them focused. This was a crime, and they needed to follow the evidence wherever it led. As they continued to question Karen, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple, isolated incident. It was as if there was a deeper motivation driving Karen's actions, a sense of entitlement that had escalated into violence. But what could have pushed her to this point? And why was she so adamant that her actions were justified? The first step in the investigation was to gather the evidence. Officers collected shell casings, took photographs of the scene, and interviewed witnesses who had been at the park that day. Many of the parents and bystanders were still shaken, but they provided the police with crucial details. Some spoke of hearing Karen shout at the children before the shooting. Others mentioned seeing her walk toward the playground with a determined look in her eyes. The police also gathered statements from those who had tried to intervene in the chaos, but no one could explain Karen's sudden outburst. To everyone, it seemed as if it had come out of nowhere. Karen's history was also scrutinized. Officers dug into her background, looking for any clues that might explain her extreme behavior. They discovered her long-standing involvement in the homeowners association and her obsession with controlling the neighborhood. They found records of complaints she had filed about children playing too close to her yard, and even reports of verbal confrontations with other parents over the years. The police learned that she had made it clear more than once that she wanted to keep the park, especially the area near her property, quiet and free from children. However, none of these prior incidents had been violent. None of them had given any indication that Karen was capable of such an extreme act. As the investigation continued, the police turned their focus to the legal aspects of the case. Was there any indication that Karen had a legitimate claim to self-defense? The evidence didn't suggest so. The playground was a public space, and the children playing there were not trespassing or causing any harm. Witnesses confirmed that the child, the mother's daughter, had not done anything to provoke Karen. The only logical conclusion was that Karen had shot the child in cold blood, driven by a sense of ownership over the park and a belief that she could enforce her rules regardless of the consequences. The police were also tasked with speaking to the mother. Though she was still emotionally overwhelmed, her statements were clear. She had been at the park, watching her daughter play, when the shooting occurred. She had seen Karen standing at the edge of the playground, her eyes fixed on her daughter, and had noticed the tension in the air. The mother admitted she had always felt uneasy around Karen, but never once had she imagined that things would escalate this far. The mother's account, paired with the other witness statements, painted a troubling picture of Karen's mentality, one that was driven by an obsessive need to control her surroundings to enforce her own warped sense of order. As the police worked to piece together the facts, they couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. This was not just a random act of violence. This was the culmination of years of escalating tension and a dangerous mindset that had finally boiled over. Karen's actions seemed to be motivated by something deeper than mere irritation or a misplaced sense of justice. It was clear that she had been living with resentment toward the children and the parents in the neighborhood, and she had chosen to act on those feelings in the most extreme way possible. The more the police delved into the investigation, the more it became clear that Karen was not just a victim of a momentary lapse in judgment. She had carefully planned her actions, whether consciously or subconsciously. Her gun was easily accessible, and she had not hesitated to use it. Her statements following the incident only further confirmed the troubling nature of her mindset. The police were left to wonder what had been going through her mind in the moments before the shooting. Had she felt threatened by the children's presence? Was this truly a case of protecting her property, or was it something far more sinister? A way for Karen to exert control over a world that she felt was slipping away from her grasp? As the investigation progressed, the police began to prepare for the legal proceedings. The case would be one of intense scrutiny, with the public watching closely to see how the justice system would handle a crime so shocking and senseless. But for the mother, the investigation was only the beginning. There was still the long road ahead, the fight to ensure her daughter's recovery, and the fight to make sure Karen was held accountable for her actions. The police were focused on gathering evidence, but for the mother, the most important thing was to make sure that Karen would never hurt anyone again. As the days passed, the weight of the tragedy began to set in for the family. The hospital visits, the uncertainty of their daughter's condition, and the emotional toll of what had happened were all consuming. But amid the physical and emotional recovery, a new battle had begun, the legal fight for justice. The mother, still reeling from the shock of the event, knew that this was just the beginning. Karen's actions had shattered their lives, and now it was up to the legal system to ensure that Karen would be held accountable for what she had done. The first step in this journey was the arraignment. Karen was charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and the illegal use of a firearm. It was a serious case, and yet when Karen appeared in court, she seemed unbothered by the gravity of the situation. Her demeanor remained as cold and detached as it had been at the scene of the shooting. She wore a stoic expression, as if the charges against her were no more significant than a minor inconvenience. The public, the press, and the family were all present, waiting for her to show some sign of remorse, some recognition of the pain she had caused. But Karen gave none. Instead, she remained composed, her eyes distant, as if this entire ordeal was something that didn't truly concern her. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution laid out the charges. They highlighted Karen's long history of complaints and confrontations in the neighborhood, painting a picture of a woman who had become obsessed with control and who, when she couldn't impose her will on others, resorted to violence. They focused on the testimony from witnesses, the evidence collected at the scene, and the chilling words Karen had spoken after the shooting. She was asking for it. The prosecution argued that there was no justification for what had happened, that Karen's actions were driven by an irrational sense of entitlement, and that her disregard for human life was clear in the coldness of her actions. For the mother, sitting in that courtroom was one of the hardest things she had ever done. The emotional pain was still fresh, and hearing Karen's defense, the same cold, calculated words, only reignited the rage and grief she had been feeling since the day of the shooting. She watched as Karen sat there, seemingly unbothered, while her daughter was fighting for her life in the hospital. It was a battle of emotions, the desire for justice, the hope for healing, and the overwhelming need to protect her child from ever having to experience such cruelty again. Karen's defense attorney, however, was quick to try and paint a different picture. They argued that Karen had acted out of fear for her own safety, that she had felt threatened by the children who were trespassing near her property, and that the shooting had been an unfortunate but necessary act of self-defense. The defense team also attempted to portray Karen as a woman pushed to the edge, someone who had been under tremendous stress from her ongoing disputes with the neighborhood. They claimed that her actions, while extreme, were a result of a moment of heightened emotional distress. It was an argument that felt weak to many in the room, but one that was nonetheless being put forth in an attempt to lessen the severity of the charges. The prosecution wasted no time in dismantling this defense. They reminded the court that the park was a public space and that there was no evidence of any immediate threat that would justify Karen's actions. The idea of self-defense seemed ludicrous when presented alongside the fact that Karen had shot a defenseless child who had not provoked her in any way. The witnesses had all described a calm, collected Karen who had made a deliberate decision to act out of a sense of superiority, not fear. The prosecution hammered home the point that Karen had been fixated on controlling the park to the point where she believed she had the right to enforce her own rules with deadly force. Throughout the proceedings, the mother remained focused, determined to ensure that Karen would face the full consequences of her actions. Her daughter, still in critical condition, had become the emotional center of the case. The mother spoke briefly to the court, her voice breaking as she described the impact of the shooting on her family. She recounted how the joy of their regular visits to the park had been shattered, how her daughter, who had always been so full of life, was now fighting for survival. Her words were heartfelt, raw, and full of pain, and they resonated deeply with everyone in the room. It was clear that this wasn't just a case about a child being shot. It was about a family torn apart, about a mother who had to watch her child suffer for no reason at all. The courtroom proceedings went on for days, and the evidence continued to mount against Karen. The mother's emotional testimony, the witness accounts, the collected evidence, it all painted a picture of a woman who had crossed a line that no one could justify. The pressure on Karen grew as the case progressed, and with each new piece of evidence, her defense seemed weaker and weaker. The public, the media, and the community were all watching, eager to see how the legal system would handle a case that was so emotionally charged, so raw. As the trial continued, the mother knew that this was only the beginning of the journey. The road ahead would be long, filled with more court appearances, more emotional pain, and more challenges. But in that moment, as she sat in the courtroom, she felt a sense of determination that she hadn't felt since the day of the shooting. She would fight for justice, not just for her daughter, but for every parent who feared that their children could be harmed in the very place they were meant to be safe. She would make sure that Karen paid for what she had done and that her actions would never be forgotten. The legal battle was just beginning, and the mother was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. As the legal proceedings continued, the community's response to the incident grew more intense. What had initially seemed like an isolated tragedy was rapidly becoming a point of widespread outrage. The story of Karen, the HOA president who had shot a child at the playground, had made headlines across the region. News outlets, both local and national, began to pick up the story, and it wasn't long before public opinion was divided, though not equally. On one side, there were those who supported Karen. Some argued that her actions were an unfortunate result of her stress and frustration, that the pressures of being an HOA president had taken a toll on her mental health. Others claimed that the children's presence at the park had been too disruptive, that parents were allowing their children to overstep boundaries, and that Karen had simply snapped in the face of this ongoing frustration. These individuals, though few in number, took to social media and letters to the editor to voice their support for Karen, echoing her claim that she had acted in self-defense. They painted her as a victim of the community's lack of respect for rules and boundaries. However, the overwhelming majority of the public was horrified by the shooting. People from all walks of life expressed their anger and disbelief at Karen's actions. Parents across the nation voiced their concerns about the safety of their own children, sharing stories of their own experiences in playgrounds and parks. Many felt a deep sense of empathy for the mother, whose child had been so senselessly harmed. News outlets featured interviews with local residents, child psychologists, and experts on gun violence, all of whom condemned Karen's actions. Social media erupted with hashtags such as hashtag Justice for the Daughter and hashtag Karen Must Pay, as well as calls for stricter gun control laws and accountability for those who felt entitled to impose their will through violence. The backlash against Karen became so intense that she found herself facing protests outside her home. Neighbors, who had once been too intimidated to speak out against her, now organized demonstrations calling for her resignation from the HOA and demanding justice for the child. The protests intensified with each passing day, and the pressure mounted on Karen as she realized that the support she had once enjoyed was quickly evaporating. No longer was she seen as a woman simply enforcing neighborhood rules. She was now a symbol of entitlement, violence, and disregard for human life. Within the local community, the sense of betrayal ran deep. The park, which had always been a safe space for families, was now a place of fear and division. People who had once gathered there with their children now found themselves second-guessing their safety. Parents exchanged worried glances as they walked past Karen's house, wondering if something similar could happen to their own families. The park, which had once been a symbol of freedom and fun for children, was now tainted by the memory of what had happened there. It had become a reminder that even in the most familiar places, danger could strike without warning. The outrage reached the local government, and soon the city council was pressured to take action. Calls for a review of the HOA's practices grew louder. Many questioned whether Karen's position as HOA president had given her too much power, whether the community had allowed her to become a figure who believed she could control not just the neighborhood, but also the lives of others. Some even pushed for a reevaluation of the HOA's authority in the community, suggesting that such power should be subject to stricter oversight. The controversy surrounding the case also raised broader questions about gun violence and personal responsibility. Gun control advocates seized on the incident as evidence of the need for stricter regulations, arguing that Karen's actions were an example of the dangers of unregulated access to firearms. The shooting, they said, was not just about one individual's mental state, it was about a larger issue of how easily people could access weapons and use them without sufficient accountability. The conversation expanded beyond just Karen's case. It became a larger societal discussion about how violence could be prevented before it reached the point of irreparable harm. Amid the outrage, the mother found herself thrust into the public spotlight. She had never intended to become a public figure, but her daughter's case had made her an unwilling symbol of every parent's worst nightmare. She was interviewed by news stations, asked to speak at rallies, and featured in op-eds. Despite the overwhelming support she received, the attention was a heavy burden. She had wanted nothing more than to protect her daughter, and now she found herself fighting not just for justice for her child, but also for her own mental peace. The media coverage, while intense, also provided a platform for her to share her story, and she did so with grace and strength. She spoke of her daughter's recovery, the physical and emotional wounds that would take years to heal, and the deep sense of betrayal she felt from a woman who had been a neighbor, a member of her community, and yet had so violently upended their lives. The public responded to her vulnerability and courage, further cementing the sense of injustice felt by so many. Her bravery in speaking out became a rallying cry for others who felt powerless against systems of authority that could be used to harm innocent people. Despite the overwhelming backlash, Karen remained unrepentant. She continued to maintain that her actions were justified, refusing to acknowledge the emotional and physical devastation she had caused. Her refusal to accept responsibility only fueled the anger and frustration from the public, intensifying the calls for accountability. Every new report, every new rally, and every social media post seemed to build on the public's anger, making it clear that Karen's actions had ignited a firestorm of outrage that was impossible to ignore. The public's reaction was not just about the shooting, it was about what it represented. It was about the dangers of unchecked power, the abuse of authority, and the violence that could result from a warped sense of entitlement. It was about a community realizing that they had been complacent in allowing someone like Karen to grow so powerful. And it was about a mother still reeling from the trauma of the event who became the face of a larger conversation about justice, safety, and the rights of every individual to live without fear. The outrage did not die down, it only grew, ensuring that Karen would be held accountable not just in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion. The community had spoken, and it was clear that no amount of justification could erase the pain and suffering Karen had caused. It was now up to the legal system to deliver the justice that the public demanded. As the trial progressed and the public's outrage reached its peak, a surprising twist emerged in the case that no one could have anticipated. The emotional tension, the years of built-up resentment in the community, and the public outcry had all set the stage for a dramatic conclusion. But no one, not even the mother, could have predicted what was about to unfold. The defense had continued to argue that Karen's actions had been in self-defense, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. They had painted a picture of a woman driven to the edge by a constant barrage of noise and disobedience from the children who played near her property. However, despite the convincing nature of their defense, something was missing. The critical flaw in Karen's argument was that she never truly acknowledged the severity of her actions. She never showed genuine remorse. Her lack of empathy, both in the courtroom and in her interactions with the community, had made her defense seem hollow. She seemed unable or unwilling to grasp the full extent of the harm she had caused. Then, out of nowhere, a new piece of evidence came to light. The breakthrough wasn't the result of a brilliant new discovery by the prosecution or a witness who had been hiding in the wings. It came from Karen's own past, a series of old emails, private communications, and documents that had been overlooked in the initial stages of the investigation. These documents revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that had gone unnoticed by everyone, including the police. They were emails that Karen had sent to the HOA board members, her neighbors, and even some of the parents in the neighborhood, containing threats and veiled warnings about the children who played near her property. The emails were chilling in their content. In one, Karen had explicitly stated that she believed the children playing near her home were too loud and too disruptive, and that she would not tolerate it much longer. She had gone so far as to suggest that something should be done about the children who were causing a ruckus. The emails seemed to reveal that Karen had been planning something, though she may not have been fully aware of it at the time. The words seemed to show a clear, premeditated intent to take action against those she perceived as a threat to her peace and control. She had felt justified in using force, and the shooting seemed to be the final violent culmination of her obsession with maintaining order on her own terms. This discovery shifted the course of the trial. The emails, which were now undeniable evidence of Karen's state of mind, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. They were presented to the jury, showing that Karen's actions were not a result of a momentary lapse in judgment or a snap decision driven by fear. Instead, they revealed a woman who had been harboring resentment, a woman who had been slowly and methodically planning to take control of the park in whatever way she could. The emails illustrated that she had seen the children not as innocent kids playing, but as intruders in her world, a world she believed she had the right to dominate. The revelation stunned the courtroom. The defense was caught off guard, unable to counter the evidence in a convincing manner. Karen's defense attorney attempted to argue that the emails were taken out of context, that they didn't necessarily reflect Karen's true intentions. But the damage had already been done. The emails painted a clear picture of a woman who was no longer acting in a moment of emotional distress, but was instead methodically carrying out a plan that had been brewing for a long time. The jury deliberated for hours, but the outcome was clear. The overwhelming evidence, combined with the public outcry and the mother's emotional testimony, left little room for doubt. Karen was convicted of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and the unlawful use of a firearm. The sentence handed down was significant, though it would never erase the trauma Karen had inflicted on the family and the community. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a decision that seemed to offer some sense of closure, though it would not erase the pain the family had suffered. For the mother, the conviction was bittersweet. It was a moment of justice, yes, but it didn't bring back the carefree days at the park, the moments of joy she had shared with her daughter. The emotional scars would remain, as would the memory of the terrifying day that had changed everything. The mother could never forget the look on her daughter's face when she fell to the ground, the blood staining the sand beneath her. But with the conviction, she finally felt that her daughter's suffering had been acknowledged, that the community's outrage had been justified. The resolution of the case brought the family some peace, but it was only a small step in the long journey of healing. The road ahead would be filled with physical and emotional recovery, therapy, and rebuilding the sense of security that had been shattered. But in that moment, as the judge read the verdict, there was a small sense of justice being served, and the mother felt that, at least for now, her fight for her daughter had been won. The community, too, began to heal. Protests outside Karen's home gradually faded, and the park, though forever tainted by the events that had unfolded there, slowly began to return to normal. Parents, once fearful, began to bring their children back to the playground, determined to reclaim it as a safe space. The sense of unease that had gripped the neighborhood began to dissipate, but it would never truly disappear. The memory of what had happened would always linger, but the conviction provided a sense of closure, a reminder that even in the face of senseless violence, justice could still prevail. In the end, the unexpected resolution of the case served as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of community support, and the need for accountability. For the mother and her daughter, it was the first step in a long journey of healing, but one that they would face together with the strength of their community behind them. Thank you for watching this incredible journey unfold. Make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories for more gripping tales of justice, community struggles, and shocking events. Don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when our next story drops. Stay tuned, and remember, your voice matters.